Module 6 is really about how we look at and evaluate evidence, how we come to develop our beliefs, how we come to get the information necessary to make decisions or judgments. And one of the things it talks about is primary and secondary sources. So in this short video, I'm going to talk a lot about how we tell the difference between a primary and secondary source, and more importantly, why it's important to be able to tell the difference between the two sources, because it comes down to how we use them. The first part of this class was focused primarily on reasoning and explanation in the classical sense. Deduction kind of defines courses in logic. Coupling deduction and induction together is kind of what a critical thinking course is traditionally focused on. Adding abduction is sort of to add acknowledgement to how we've been reasoning all along, how we come up with new explanations. But something's changing, and I think this textbook is a really nice example of that. This is kind of a new feature of critical thinking classes. Like, we're suddenly interested in the difference, for example, between primary and secondary sources and how to evaluate their use. Like, why do we care about that all of a sudden? Why are we moving beyond these sort of classical argument forms and discussions of fallacies, which we will actually get to in the near future, to looking at things about text, sources, reviewing, fact checking? Why have we changed our emphasis? And I think perhaps the main reason we've done this is that the sources of information are far more varied than they've ever used to be. There was a time when the New York Times or a network television program would speak authoritatively on the way the world was, and we would accept their facts as the facts. But since the advent of the internet, and I'd argue even before then, information has become more splintered. The sources have grown and expanded in all sorts of different ways. I get most of my information from people who are compiling it from other sources of information, who might be compiling it from even more sources of information. So the evidence tracking that we used to do, that was so easy to do when there were so few limited outlets for information, has changed dramatically. And I think to some extent this means more stories can be told, and that's great. But of course, fewer stories that are told are checked, are backed up, are supported. We come to trust the things that we trust. And often the things that we trust because, well, they're stuff we already believed in the first place. So part of a course like this needs to address the fact that our sources of information are changing, and therefore our approaches to how we read information should change as well. One of the distinctions that we often make when we talk about sourcing is the distinction between primary and secondary sources. I know this is something you guys have done in high school, maybe even junior high school, when you're asked to sort of, hey, what's a primary source? What's a secondary source? And then ask yourself, how do you use them differently? I think we spend a lot of time when we discuss this. And in fact, I think our textbook spends a lot of time discussing how we tell the two apart. And I don't think it's actually that complicated. And so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the difference between primary sources and secondary sources here. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is important with this distinction, which I don't think you see in every discussion of it. So the first thing I want to say about primary source is that it's evidence. It usually involves immediate, direct connections to the phenomena being described or judged. It's often first-hand or contemporary accounts of the thing that's being said. So when we think about a lab report, right? It's somebody who was there, who's doing the experiment. When we think about historical account of, let's say, the Kennedy assassination, we look at the sources of people who witnessed it, who were involved in the situation. And usually this comes in what I call an uninterpreted or raw format. And what that means is that it's pretty neutral about what it's trying to prove. It's trying to record something. It's not trying to prove something. And though primary sources can in fact involve attempts to prove things, in general, they have this kind of neutrality in the presentation of the information. So when we think about what are some examples of a primary source, well, I think about the evidence at a crime scene. Right? That is presented raw and uninterpreted. It's the detective's job to develop a theory of what's going on. Experimental data in the sciences, of course, any kind of witness information, any kind of first-hand account of what happened at a particular time. Photos typically are viewed as primary sources, even though, of course, photos can be manipulated, and even the person taking a photo can manipulate it to look certain ways. In general, we think of photos as objective recordings of a specific instance. Diaries can also say a lot about what's happening at a particular time. often in a way that records the information in this raw format, in a way that's saying, this is what happened as I saw it. Another thing that we can talk about are artifacts, right? Things that we discover in the dirt, so to speak, right? I kind of think of this image that I've put here of a cave painting as a classic example of an artifact, a portrayal of what people were thinking and recording in a given instant. So those are primary sources, writ large, and it's a very broad category, but I think the main idea of it is that it is getting you as close to the way things are on the ground as possible by recording it without any kind of intervening information. And so secondary sources are what comes after, usually after something like interpretation or analysis. They typically are secondhand. They are indirect acquaintance with the material. So you're gathering the evidence that you've gotten from primary sources and used it to apply it to understanding a particular situation or phenomena. Often we think of these as compilations, analyses of primary source reports, right? Use of data and interpretation of data. So this is often theoretical, it's explanatory, it's trying to take the data and put it together in a way that makes sense of it. So we can see this in terms of textbooks, biographies often do this, where you take a lot of different sources and you try to develop a more complete picture of a person's lives. We think of scientific articles or discussions as an attempt to make headway into understanding a phenomena by using all of the available evidence. Documentaries, classic example of using primary sources in terms of photography, interviews, etc., to get to the bottom of a particular topic. Similarly, reviews often compile lots of information to evaluate a particular perspective. I use this example here of Gibbon's famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was this enormous set of volumes that dealt with the end of the Roman Empire and his theories. I think it was published in the 18th century. Really, one of the first main works of historical interpretation and analysis from the Roman era. And it's works like these that help define what I mean by a secondary source. A secondary source usually involves what I call intervening theory or interpretation. And another way of putting it is that a secondary source is a kind of operation defined over the primary source material. It is taking that material and using it, usually after processing it in a particular way. In this image that I created here, I make two distinctions between intervening theory, which is the basis on which you ground your interpretation, and analysis, which is how you read the primary source information from the beginning. So you've got interpretation, you've got compilation, you've got selection. Think about the examples that you use, the primary sources that you employ in making a point. That is an editorial decision. That is an intervention in the primary sources. You're saying this is important, the other stuff is not important. And that might not be biased necessarily, but at the same time, it reflects a refinement of the data as opposed to a raw interpretation of it. So it is a use of evidence. It's not the creation of new evidence. And obviously these things can be very influential, but they have to be seen as influential through the lens of interpretation, right? And of course, in such cases, the theory, the depiction of the past or the event or the phenomena being discussed is only going to be as good as the reliability of the lens that you use. So you've got two different concerns here. You've got how good is the evidence, how good is the primary sourcing that I'm using? Is it authentic? Is it real? And that, of course, is a level of critical engagement you need to employ. But also, how good is my interpretation in terms of the intellectual capacities I'm bringing to bear on the topic? Recognizing that there is this difference between primary and secondary sources, and that it's primarily defined by how they're used, I think is really important, because a primary source is meant to supply evidence, where a secondary source is a take on that evidence, where that take is modulated by some sort of theory, interpretation, analysis, or choice. And if you present a secondary source as if it were a primary source, you're kind of obscuring the work you've done in analyzing and sifting through the primary source material. You can kind of hide your impact on reading a particular text by engaging with it as if it were a primary source. So because of that, we've got to be careful when we're looking at secondary sources to not portray them as if they are primary. Let's run through a quick example. I've already mentioned Gibbon's book, Decline and Fall, It was a history of the Roman Empire that was developed in the late 18th century, and because of that, it served as a classic example of a secondary source. It used tons of material that Gibbons had extracted from classical sources to create an account of why Rome fell. And he had all sorts of reasons, including things like moral decay as an essential part of why Roman history turned out the way that it did. Now, I'm going to offer here a quick thesis that might turn around how we think about this as a secondary source. So look at this thesis. Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire functions as a product of its own Enlightenment era, reflecting the period's emphasis on reason, secularism, and a moralistic interpretation of historical causation. That's a mouthful, but what we're trying to do in a thesis like this is use Gibbon's book as evidence for how history was done during the Enlightenment. And because of that, it is not a secondary source. It becomes a primary source in that context of trying to understand how history is done. So a secondary source can become a primary source depending on how you're going to use it to advance a particular claim. Now, as a secondary source, Gibbon's work is not actually really great. I mean, it's very problematic in terms of the evidence he had access to, in terms of the theories of history that he was using to try to understand how Rome fell. So I don't think I would read that today as a secondary source. However, if I was writing a paper or a book about how history was created in the 18th century, I think this would be great evidence. So what might be a poor secondary source could be a great primary source, again, depending how it's used. Okay, I said I was going to go quickly. I didn't go that quickly, but thank you guys for listening, and I'll have a couple more short videos for this module coming up.